So, Asha, does this mean Trump can send the military into all of our cities?
It's complicated.
I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal and national security analyst.
And I'm Steve Vladeck. I teach at Georgetown University Law Center in not quite federalized Washington, D.C., and I write the One First Substack newsletter.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a skeet.
Welcome back.
I feel like every time you guys have me on the show, something bad has happened.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Something really complicated, so complicated and so sinister that we need you to help dig through this.
Can't you have me on once for good news?
Well, we don't usually have guests. And so when we have guests, it's really because we want somebody who is the expert in it, who's just going to break it down. And I know that you have been working overtime this week to explain all the nooks and crannies of the president's authorities over law enforcement, over the military, and how they differ in Washington, D.C. versus the rest of the country, and whether that even matters anymore. Because I'm not convinced, Steve, to be honest, that it does. I mean, I know that it does legally, but I'm skeptical.
Well, I will try to persuade you that it does matter, and in fact, that the way Trump is doing this is proof that it matters.
Okay, good. Okay, so let's start. I read your One First this week because my eyes always glaze over when there's the military stuff, because I get confused about how the different authorities operate. But basically, the National Guard piece is relatively straightforward, right? That the National Guard in DC is under the direct command of the president.
And that's unique. I mean, I think it's really important to highlight that even in the other federal territories, the territorial governor, take Guam, for example, is actually the commander-in-chief of the National Guard. Oh. DC is the only place in the country, including the only federal territory, where the president controls the National Guard, even when it's not federalized. That is to say, even when it's in its local capacity. But it's also a tiny National Guard. And so the fact that Trump can use the DC National Guard doesn't really buy him very much. It gets him 800 troops who, by all accounts to this point, are just hanging out around the monuments. That's really not, to me, the bigger part of the story. The bigger part of the story is the MPD piece.
So, and Renato, if you don't mind me just following up with a question here. So Congress sets the parameters under which the militia of the several states, and including DC, are called into service. Is the reason that DC is singled out in this way because of the unique kind of vulnerability that DC has specifically for, in terms of attacks and things like that? Is that the idea? Is that why it's different than the territories and stuff?
Yes and no. I mean, there really are two reasons, and you've hit on one of them. One of them is the sense that DC is special and the president shouldn't have to depend upon the mayor to use troops. Right, in that context. But actually, one of the reasons is entirely anachronistic. And because of the historical quirk that DC didn't have a local government from 1874 to 1973. And so when the modern National Guard system was created in 1903, and when it was, sort of modernized in the early 1930s, there was no mayor of DC. DC was run by this 3-member board of commissioners that was basically controlled by Congress. So, part of it, I think, Asha, is when Congress wrote the Home Rule Act in 1973, it kept that structure. It left the president in charge of the DC National Guard, I think at least for some reasons along the lines you've described. But the president only had that authority in the first place because DC, at the time the DC National Guard was created, had no local government to control it.
I'm just glad that we've cleared up that Nancy Pelosi does not, in fact, control the National Guard.
Well, I mean, listen, the stupidest piece of all of this is how much it completely proves what people like I were saying on January 6th, which is the president doesn't need Nancy Pelosi to use the DC National Guard. Oh, by the way, he also didn't need Glenn Youngkin to federalize, or I don't even remember who the governor of Virginia was on January 6th. He doesn't need anyone, right? He could have federalized the Guard, but that's another story for another podcast.
So one thing you mentioned, Steve, and I think this is so important, is Trump is starting with DC. And in my mind, there's a reason he's starting with DC, because it's much easier to do it legally in DC. And it gets everyone used to the idea that we need, and he's getting his base used to the idea that we need troops because we have low crime rates, or lower crime rates than we've had recently. We need troops. And this is something, by the way, that has not been the norm in the United States of America. It is a change. And he's doing this so that this way, when he wants to, and he's already previewing this, when he wants to use troops in New York, when he wants to use troops in Chicago, two cities he doesn't like, because perhaps they're blue cities, perhaps because their mayors have stood up to him in the past, and the governors of those states have stood up to him in the past, it will give him some excuse or some quote unquote precedent that's not really precedent to do that.
I mean, I think that's such an important point, and I really do think it's a lot of what's going on here is an effort to move the Overton window and to desensitize, the folks who are not the legal nerds about the just complete abnormality of using the military or federalizing local law enforcement in contexts that aren't like clear and undisputed emergencies. And Renato, just to be as clear as possible on the legal authorities, there's no universe in which the president would have any ability to commandeer local police anywhere in the country except Washington. And with regard to the military, that's where we get into what the president tried in Los Angeles.
California, yeah.
Right, which was to, so there he federalized the California National Guard. So he took them out of the control of Governor Newsom, and he deployed them, for the purpose of ostensibly protecting ICE officers as they were going about their business. But what's really striking about the Los Angeles example, and what's really striking about the DC example, and this is where I was trying to hint at with Asha at the top, is how much the law is actually shaping what they're doing. So, in Los Angeles, we've had testimony this week in a trial in a San Francisco federal courtroom about just how much everyone on the ground in Los Angeles was trying to avoid violating something called the Posse Comitatus Act. And in DC, both of the authorities Trump is using, by using the DC National Guard without federalizing it, by, calling out some of the DC Metropolitan Police Department, are also backdoors around the Posse Comitatus Act, this 1878 statute that codifies the idea that we don't use the military for law enforcement unless Congress has specifically authorized it. Asha, to me, a big part of the story is, at least to this point, they haven't crossed that line, maybe so that if and when they do, it won't seem like that big a deal.
Can I just get some distinctions here? So you said he hasn't federalized the National Guard. He's just called in the National Guard in DC. So that means that they right now can only be used for federal. Like, I thought that the DC National Guard, once they're called in, could be used for routine law enforcement without invoking the Insurrection Act, and that was a difference between DC and the states as well.
That has been what we've always assumed. It is a position that the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel took in a 1989 memo. It is not a line that they apparently have crossed yet. So, one of the really interesting things about what's happening in DC is what's not happening in DC. And Asha, I think, the government would have a non-frivolous argument that the unique status of the DC National Guard means you can use them for ordinary law enforcement without violating the Posse Comitatus Act. Let me talk about why, right? So the Posse Comitatus Act, if you have your U.S. codes at home, it's, volume 18, title 18, section 1385. It says you can't use the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, whatever, for law enforcement purposes without specific authorization from Congress or the Constitution. The DC National Guard is not the Army until it's federalized, right? The California National Guard is not the Army until it's federalized. Until then, they're just the militia. And, that is supposed to be why the DC National Guard was this exception. But Asha, even there, all we've seen to date, and, the media reports I've seen today, are that the DC National Guard folks who have been deployed, like the 17 of them, are hanging out around the monuments, right? They're patrolling federal property where there's no question as to their, legal authority. That says to me, back to Renato's question, that what we're seeing here is an attempt to sort of move the political optics of all of this without provoking, the bigger legal fights. And that says to me two things. One, that the law is constraining, but two, that it's really important for folks to understand that and to understand why legally this is not a precedent for the president's power to do anything like this anywhere else in the country.
One thing you've convinced me is that it was a very good idea that we had you on this week, because I didn't understand all of those distinctions. And it's interesting to me because at times, one thing that Asha and I have discussed is this a smart use of power to try to, achieve Trump's ends, or are there times where Trump's team has been clumsy or passed up opportunities? This appears to be a very clever way to try to expand, as you put it, the Overton window in a way that achieves their goals while technically, sidestepping legal challenges for now.
And I think what makes it especially, you use the word clever, I would use the word nefarious, right? Is what they're really desensitizing us to is how viable the factual predicate needs to be. Right? That the relevant statute they're relying upon to, commandeer some of the MPD's assets refers to an emergency. Where, the federal command of the MPD is necessary, quote, for federal purposes, unquote. There is no plausible claim, right, that the MPD needs to be under federal control for any reason right now. The fact that, what's his nickname? Big Balls,
Big Balls.
Right? The fact that one guy got carjacked in what appears by all accounts to be a random attack unrelated to his prior employment by Doge, right, is just a pretext. And so you have folks online saying that this is like our Reichstag fire moment. I think that's overstated, but I actually think it is worth highlighting that part of what we're being desensitized to is the president standing up and saying we have an emergency based on facts that are completely not true, and in defiance of statistics maintained by his own Department of Justice.
So just for our listeners, that they understand that we're talking about two things here. We were talking about the National Guard, but the Home Rule Act that you referenced earlier also allows the president to federalize, I guess, is that the word that is used, the MPD or to use them for quote unquote federal purposes for up to 30 days, right? It is a time limited thing. So there's the control over the National Guard, and then there is this limited control over the local law enforcement. And what you're saying is the control over the local law enforcement, that is just a one and done in DC. That is just simply not anything that can happen anywhere else. Everybody needs to go. They need to shout that from the rooftops. They need to tell their friends, need to call their mom and dad. But with the National Guard, there are ways, as we saw in Los Angeles, for the president to, I guess, I would call it seizing control based on what he did in LA. And there's two different provisions, right? And there's one that has language about federalizing the National Guard. And this is what's being litigated right now in Los Angeles. And it's sort of, I think, turns on how much say the governor has in that action, right? Because the Trump administration is basically saying, no, we just have to give him a piece of paper and let him know that we're doing it and we're just going to do it. And they're saying, and I think the state of California is saying, no, it has to go through the governor. Like the governor has to basically acquiesce. Is that the thrust of that argument?
Yeah, and the specific authority, again, for the folks who have their U.S. code collections at home is 10 U.S.C. section 12406, which, is an authority that has not been used very often, right? Usually when the president federalizes the National Guard, he's doing it because of some other authority that has been invoked to use not just National Guard, but regular troops in some kind of emergency, a natural emergency, right? A natural disaster, right? An attack, an invasion, something. It is really unusual for the president to use 12406 by itself, which is part of what was getting litigated in the California case. And even then, Asha, the question is, at what point are the troops being used for the kinds of law enforcement activity that the Posse Comitatus Act prohibits?
Right. That even if they come under, I remember we had an exchange before that even if he were to federalize this National Guard, what that means is that the National Guard guardsmen and women are basically in the same place as the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, all of these people, and therefore limited by the same constraints, including the Posse Comitatus Act. Now,
right. So can I just take, so another way, just another way of trying to frame this for the folks who are having trouble following all these little details, work backwards, right? The question is, when can the federal government use the federal military for law enforcement purposes? Right? So when you have unfederalized state National Guard, the California National Guard sitting at home, right? That is not the federal government. That's Gavin Newsom. Right? The Alabama National Guard being deployed for hurricane relief, right? That's not the federal government. That's Alabama, right? In those circumstances, we don't worry about that because it's not the federal government, right? You could also have people who aren't military. So stepping up, ICE patrols, stepping up DEA personnel, right? Surging FBI people. That's federal, but it's not military, right? The question is, when are you using the federal military for law enforcement? And that's where we get to questions of, Asha, federalizing the California National Guard, which is what Trump did in Los Angeles, and running into the Posse Comitatus Act because now they're federal.
And just to recall, he not only federalized the California National Guard, he also sent in the Marines.
Yep.
And so at that stage, they were both under the same limitations.
Right. And so the question is basically, what hat are the troops wearing? If they're wearing federal hats, then that's when we get very nervous about whether they're doing law enforcement or not.
One thing that I think people at home might be wondering is, why does it matter whether it is the police or the FBI or ICE or the DEA versus the military? And one reason, I think that's an important one, is that law enforcement are trained to respect our rights in a way that the military is not. The military is trained to kill and subdue and achieve objectives on a battlefield, where you're trying to you're not trying to kill everyone necessarily, but you're also not being focused on, let's say, the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution or the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, other rights that we have that law enforcement is specifically trained to respect. I'm curious there's also, of course, important historical reasons why our founders were very concerned about the use of the military on the public. But I'm curious, Steve, what your thoughts are on that question.
Before Steve answers, can I just say one thing? That even the federal law enforcement, they have limited jurisdiction too. Like the park police, I guess, or, the National Zoo police that are wandering around DC right now. I mean, they're not authorized to enforce local DC law. They're not trained to do it. I mean, the FBI isn't either. The FBI is authorized by statute to enforce federal law.
Dare I say it's complicated?
But anyway, I'm just saying that, and I will say that I don't think any of them are trained to be beat cops, right? Which is a very specific kind of training. So there's a different training problem there, but go ahead with the military, we are especially concerned because of what they are trained to do. You guys know I live in DC, right? One of the TikToks that's been circulating is a video of these like random DEA officers doing a street patrol
in Northeast, right? And looking completely like fish out of water, and trying to figure out like what they're supposed to do when they walk up to people sitting on the stoop of a house, right? Drinking alcohol and, smoking marijuana, right? Renato, I think the key is twofold. One is the training point, and that's really important. But there is a deeper and subtler just sort of belief that our country is founded on the idea that military governance is coercive. And it's coercive even in the best of times and even when the leaders have the best of intentions. And it's especially coercive when those are not true. That, because of the political control of the military that is required by the Constitution, the military risks being a tool for the usurpation of power in a way that the sort of multi-gated, multi-jurisdictional, overlapping and distinct federalism-based law enforcement divisions in our country actually protect us from, right? And I think that's one of the things you risk in a world in which we get desensitized to having troops policing our streets.
And the framers were not big fans of, having the military being used against the people. I mean, I hope that, you're not going to also have to become a Third Amendment scholar, Steve. But, we overlook the Third Amendment, which prevents the quartering of troops. And that's because there were military that were all over the place and taking over people's houses.
And, the Third Amendment's part of the story. The sort of, if you read the Declaration of Independence, one of the grievances that, Thomas Jefferson lists in the long list of grievances is about rendering the civilian rule subservient to the military. I mean, right. So it's not that the military is per se bad. It's that, one, it's not their job, and two, the founders and, those who have enforced this norm down the generations, I think rightly feared that a standing army on the streets of our cities is corrosive to democratic governance. And, sometimes the emergency justifies overriding that norm. Right? If we're being invaded, if there's the kind of natural disaster that local authorities are just unable to handle, then we use troops as a fail-safe and as a backstop. But like the point is supposed to be that the exception creates the justification, not that we manufacture a justification for the exception.
One thing that I have noticed this week that has bothered me is that Trump's justification, of course, was that we had crime rates that were higher. Democrats understandably responded by pointing out that was factually inaccurate. But the debate then became like which crime statistics were correct and whether crime was up or down. And I think that really kind of concedes the main point, which is even if crime went up 10% or 20%, that does not mean we should have the United States military patrolling our streets or the National Guard. And I really think that was a fumble in many ways by Trump's opponents, most prominently the Democrats, but others, because I really think it almost bought into the framing that he was trying to create.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that, Renato, but I do think that, it is not an especially surprising rhetorical strategy at this moment in our history to say the factual predicate for your thing is false, even if it wouldn't be sufficient if it were true. Right. I mean, we're lawyers, right? And so we're thinking about arguing in the alternative in ways that maybe the politicians aren't. I think there is a broader point here, and it's one that I wish the Democrats were making more noisily, which is, the real corrosive thing is what hasn't happened yet, which is, using the National Guard. And, the very fact that Trump hasn't crossed that line, I actually think is a concession of some understanding on the part of some people in the White House that is a step and that would be a line that is a bigger deal than the surge of law enforcement capacity in DC, than the commandeering of elements of the Metropolitan Police Department. And the fact that we haven't seen the National Guard out in force anywhere besides the monuments, I don't want to say that's like it's a good thing. I don't want to say it's like, what we should all therefore not worry about this. But I think it is a sign of exactly where the dangerousness is most pernicious. And also that like maybe the White House actually understands this to a degree that they would never admit publicly.
So, can we just climb up the escalation ladder? I mean,
So the missiles are in the air.
Yeah. So, you've reassured us by saying, even if he were to federalize, try to do the bypass that he has tried to do in Los Angeles with the governor and federalizes the National Guard in these states, they are limited by the Posse Comitatus Act. So whether it's National Guard or military that he sends in, they would not be able to do routine law enforcement unless he invokes the Insurrection Act.
Right.
So let's talk about the Insurrection Act.
Yeah. So that's the elephant in the room is the Insurrection Act. So the Insurrection Act is a terrible name because it's actually not just about insurrection. It's a reference to 5 very, very old statutes about which, let the record show, I wrote my student note in law school. And the Insurrection Act matters because it is the most well-established exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. In other words, right, the one circumstance in which everybody agrees that Congress has authorized the domestic use of regular military troops under federal control for ordinary law enforcement is in the cases provided for by the Insurrection Act. The really, really tricky part is that the Insurrection Act uses remarkably vague and broad and capacious language to describe when it can be used by the president and to what ends, partly reflecting the fact that the statute hasn't been amended since 1871, right? And so, I think that the Insurrection Act has always been the elephant in the room when it comes to Trump. It is rather striking that he hasn't invoked it either in his first term, when there was a lot of discussion about maybe doing so, especially during the George Floyd-related protests in the summer of 2020. And so far to this point, Asha, my concern is that maybe he is hoping that what he's doing in DC provokes some kind of incident or episode that he could then rely upon, right? That's the concern.
I think that is exactly right. That's what we think he was hoping for on January 6th, right? That there would be a large kind of oppositional presence that might then they could blame Antifa. That's what I understood to be at the time, that they were expecting there to be more opposition, that may have things unfold differently.
Jeff Clark's correspondence, right? Like Clark referred repeatedly to the possibility of invoking the Insurrection Act in the run up to January 6th. So, it's a huge problem. People like me have been screaming for years that Congress needed to fix it. But it's also the case that it has not been invoked by any president since 1992, when President George H.W. Bush invoked it to send federal regulars to help sort of quell the unrest in Los Angeles after the Rodney King riots. And I think that's a reflection of something that's going to maybe surprise some folks, which is the notion that there are still at least some political constraints on the Trump administration, even as we've seen so many of the others fall by the wayside. Maybe this is another one of them.
So can you remind me what was the statute that was used for Alabama for the desegregation, or was it?
Oh, we use the Insurrection Act all the time. And so the Insurrection Act has this remarkable history that's been documented in really quite glorious detail by the U.S. Army Center for Military History. And, it's been used, Asha, to enforce the civil rights laws.
Yeah,
it's been used, Eisenhower relied upon the Insurrection Act to send the army into Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 to desegregate Central High School. It's been used in response to natural disasters. It's been used in response to, the Pullman strike in Chicago in the 1890s. There are lots of examples of presidents of both parties at different moments in our history using the statute in circumstances in which it was genuinely necessary to ensure the preservation of federal law and order. What we're wanting for in the history of invocations of the statute are examples where there was a genuine debate about whether there actually was a threat to law and order, right? Whether there was the degree of disorder that would justify invocation. We've never had an invocation of the Insurrection Act where it was so obviously and transparently pretextual. And I think the question I cannot answer is how would the courts react if and when we get there?
Yeah, one thing that I find very interesting here, and it's been interesting to me in kind of looking more broadly, is the ways in which the Trump administration still tries to respect the law, the courts in certain ways and in certain contexts. Like people ask me all the time, do our laws matter? And here, this is one where they're still trying to toe their way up to lines. They're trying not to go too far. They're kind of trying to have the temperature boil little by little. And it's interesting because what do you make of the fact that they're taking it slow? Is it that they have constraints, that there is other actors out there? And then who would that be, Steve?
So I'm going to go out on a limb and say something that I think I'll get pilloried for, which is I think they are still wary of the Supreme Court. Even this Supreme Court that has, ruled for the Trump administration time and again in case after case on all of these emergency applications, which I've tried to document in detail, right? I think they understand that the one way they lose sort of the support of what is left of moderate Republicans, right, is to provoke a constitutional crisis with the Supreme Court that they shouldn't win. And, it seems to me that, that's not going to be over sort of bureaucratic assertions of power, right? The Supreme Court loves nothing more than the unitary executive theory. But, Renato, I maybe this is a fiction I tell myself so I can sleep at night, but at least in their behavior to date, it sure looks like the administration doesn't think it can just willy-nilly invoke military authorities domestically and not pay a price for it politically, legally, or both.
I'll add my own theory here too, which is not mutually exclusive, but also I don't think that they have fully effectuated enough of a purge of the military itself to ensure that the military would go along with something that began to cross a lot of red lines. It's a huge institution. It's highly professionalized. It has a very strong internal code. We've seen definitely people get fired and, they're in the process, but I think it will take a long time or longer than some of the other institutions, to really get it to be as pliant as they need it to be to really do their shock and awe operations.
I mean, I think that's entirely plausible based on, Asha, both what I know about DOD and based on what we've seen publicly. I will just add one other thing, which is when, you guys and I consistently encounter folks who are probably politically aligned with us, but who yell at us for being Pollyannish, right? And I will just say, there is no way to describe either what is happening in Washington this week or the fact that Trump has not yet invoked the Insurrection Act as anything other than, the law playing a role, right? Maybe not enough of a role. Maybe, right, from the administration's perspective, to borrow a line from the Scottish writer Andrew Lang, they're using the law the way a drunk uses a lamppost, which is to say for support, not for illumination.
Oh, I thought you meant to bang your head against it.
Right. But the law is still there. And, is it there to the extent I think it should be? No. But for better or for worse, these obscure, vague, bizarre, old, anachronistic authorities are doing a lot of work in these cases. And I think, one, we should take some solace from that fact. And two, we should also be very vigilant in helping folks understand when Trump is crossing those lines as opposed to just stretching them. I know there are folks who think law doesn't matter anymore. And I will just say that there is an enormous difference between stretching the limits of authorities and just pretending that they don't exist.
So speaking of that, I would really love for you to explain to our listeners, because I tried to do this on Blue Sky and people, the people who are like, you're Pollyannish, and there are people who said even meaner things. Can you explain what martial law is? And why even if Trump goes as far as invoking the Insurrection Act, that would still not be martial law? Okay.
We're really going up the escalator. Okay. So martial law, the best way to understand the difference between invoking the Insurrection Act and martial law is to think about the difference between using the military to supplement civilian authority and using the military to supplant civilian authority. And what I mean by that is when the president lawfully invoked, take Los Angeles in 1992, when George H.W. Bush sent the army into Los Angeles, which, by the way, was not especially controversial as a political matter at the time. What the army was doing was enforcing ordinary statutes. They were enforcing federal law, and where federal property was involved, they were enforcing state law by dint of a statute you guys both know and love, known as the Assimilative Crimes Act. Right? But that's what they were doing. They were doing the same thing that the LAPD was trying to do. They were doing the same thing that the California National Guard was trying to do. They were supplementing civilian authority. The civilians were still in charge in Los Angeles. Martial law is when the military is in charge. Martial law is when there is no functioning civilian government, or even worse, when you're using the military to get rid of the functioning civilian government. The Supreme Court, in one of the most, I think, erudite explanations of this in the court's history, in Ex parte Milligan in 1866, referred to martial law not as a legal condition, but as a practical one. That martial law exists when, for whatever reason, the civilian government is unable to function, not because someone says so. Right, which is why the court struck down military commissions President Lincoln had convened in areas that were not under martial law during the Civil War. But there is an enormous difference. There's a huge chasm between using the military, even under the Insurrection Act, to help enforce and restore law and order, and using the military as its own government. And that's the line that we have been very lucky to very, very seldom cross in American history.
Well, Steve, these are just absolutely huge and monumental questions that really go to the core of what it means to be the United States of America. So I'm very grateful because people are asking me all these questions, and I feel like this is like we need the bat signal at times like this for you. So I really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. We start with 1L civil procedure next week, and thinking about what that means at this moment in American history has been quite a journey.
Yeah. Are you having to revamp your whole syllabus?
They still need to learn like personal jurisdiction and venue and stuff like that. But I don't want them to be oblivious to the ways in which the legal system itself is under pressure, the likes of which we haven't seen in a very long time.
Well, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. I want to say we look forward to having you back, but since it's never under great circumstances, I hope I never see you again. Just kidding, I'm just kidding.
Well, we could split the difference. I hope to see you not on the podcast. How about that?
Yes. Okay, great.
Well, thank you guys for having me.
Thank you. So, Asha, now that we've gotten that out of the way, we'll go to, in many ways, I thought one of the more interesting developments this week, which is a judge taking a look at Trump's request for the release of the Epstein grand jury transcripts and calling it what it is. The word disingenuous is about as close to, liar, liar, pants on fire as a judge gets, a federal judge gets. And I think it was really interesting because it really, in many ways, hooked on to something we had discussed just a few weeks ago when we talked about the difference between releasing the transcripts versus releasing the entire Epstein files.
Yeah, I think the actual ruling didn't surprise anyone who had been following it, right? I mean, we had talked about, I think, on that podcast that it was unlikely that they would be released because this is grand jury material that is under the federal rules of criminal procedure, remains secret unless it meets, these certain categories. And the government didn't really give a great reason to do it, except that, a lot of people want to see it is pretty much what the government's argument was. But as you said, what's interesting is what the commentary that the judge put. in denying the request. And there were some pretty pointed barbs in there, I thought. One that basically calls out that there really wasn't a legitimate basis for requesting this, that, just a matter of great public interest really doesn't cut the mustard here. And I thought there was the statement where the judge says someone looking at this and understanding how this all works might conclude that the purpose here is diversion, not transparency. And I was like, dang.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple other things that I would note in that decision. One was the judge made very clear there was nothing remarkable in those transcripts whatsoever. And, pointing out the fact that the fact that the Trump administration was focused on just releasing the transcripts was a red herring. And then saying, and I thought this was another really pointed barb, that really the only legitimate justification here would be to expose the disingenuousness of the Trump administration. Like the only real reason to release these would be to expose how disingenuous this was, because there's nothing here that would surprise anyone.
Right. That it was basically, what did you say, garden variety summaries by two law enforcement officers, much of which was disclosed at trial later. Like, in other words, there's nothing new there that nobody would have known already. I thought it was also interesting where he said that this has been misleading the victims.
Yeah. Very interesting. I mean, it really was quite a takedown, and I think it's an example of how, to hook back into what we were discussing with Steve a minute ago. So in some ways, the courts and laws matter. And here's one where a judge, I think, issuing an opinion was able to help educate the press in many ways, which had sort of played into some of that for a period of time. It took a while for the press to not just reflexively repeat what the Trump administration was saying about the grand jury transcripts. And here was a judge laying it all out. And to you or I, it didn't surprise us. I mean, we talked about this weeks ago. What's going to be in those grand jury transcripts is not going to be anything important or surprising, really. And I thought the judge did a really nice job of exposing that stunt for what it was.
Yeah. And I thought the point about potentially misleading the victims, because I think the victims had said that they supported the release, right? And he says they, I believe that they are saying that they want this material released because they have been led to believe that there's going to be something new in here, and there's nothing new in here. And it just was an echo, by the way, just of the deal that Acosta made back in the Southern District of Florida, which a judge later found had also misled the victim. So just to kind of keep them front and center of this whole thing, that they kind of are getting, mistreated at every stage. It seems like it's very unfortunate, and by the government's own attorneys that are doing this, kind of used as pawns. And I think that is really unfortunate. One of the things, though, that you and I talked about is just how much that some of these other shenanigans, like the stuff in DC and everything else, has in many ways largely succeeded in being a diversionary tactic.
Yeah. When you look at the polling, the interest that people on the right have now in the Epstein files is plummeted dramatically by a massive margin. And it's really that whole Obama files thing that Gabbard, did, that was something that could, give the right wing shows something to talk about. DC, we just talked about in the last segment. But the bottom line is Trump is finding ways to distract his base, and he's getting away with essentially hiding something that he had promised he would reveal, and likely because it has something embarrassing to him hidden within that.
Teflon Don.
Appears so. Very much a master, not other things, but a master of manipulating and misleading the public. So, Asha, before we go, I mean, first of all, we had, I think, a fantastic happy hour this week for our cruise. More to follow. So if you haven't signed up for those, there's no commitment necessary. You could just sign up and come on to Zooms with us and chat with us about potentially joining us on our cruise.
Yeah. And, our cruise is to Alaska. And this may be the last time to take a cruise to Alaska before it's given away to Russia.
Yeah, it's actually a cruise to Russia now. We're going to have to change our promotional materials. But speaking of journeys, I think you've got one coming up for a member of your household.
I do. I dropped my son, my oldest, off at college next week.
Oh, wow. That's exciting. You still have your daughter at home, so you're not an empty nester yet.
I'm not an empty nester yet. So it's, but I have to say, he had done a gap year in India. So he had been gone last year. And I mean, of course, I missed him and I was sad. But I have to say, this feels more this feels like the permanent piece. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's really kind of fleeing the nest. And I have to say, it makes me so nostalgic because, he's going to my alma mater. And so a lot of that, I still remember my first night in my dorm room. He's actually in the same residential college dormitory that I was in. So it's it's weird. It's bringing back all of these memories. And it's sort of bittersweet because I remember how excited I was and how, you have your 4 years ahead of you. And I'm like, that's all over. That's a chapter of my past. Now I'm old and I don't have anything like that. And I'm weirdly envious. I wish I was going off to college again.
Wow, man, you're a guy.
I'm in it. I'm feeling all the things. I am.
You are. Well, this is more than we can talk about today. But my stepdaughter's going to college. She doesn't start for over a month. And she's going to be living at home and commuting to and from college. So it's not the same as, having this sort of fleeing of the nest permanently. You never know. He might come back, but probably not. I'm going to bet not for him.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
I don't think so.
Is your daughter counting down the days on her end? Is she really excited about going to?
I don't know. I think, it's interesting. She keeps her cards close to the chest, and I think it's sometimes when sibling dynamics are always really interesting. Do you have siblings?
I don't. I'm an only child.
You're an only child. Yeah. So I think sometimes when it's if the younger sibling might feel like they're in the older sibling's shadow.
Oh, so now she can blossom.
So she can blossom, but also she may not want to reveal that she wants to do maybe similar things or I don't know. It's all, there's a lot of cloak and dagger happening. So I don't think she is counting down the days, but I'm not sure.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.